I'm curious. I am curious. Curious.
By nature.
Welcome to Curious by Nature. I'm Jessica Johnson from Newswise. Today we'll look at how you can engage creativity to address anxiety. Many approaches for therapists and educators seem to emphasize calming the overactive mind to give relief from these intense emotions. In contrast to this conventional wisdom, our guest today is a researcher who has found that activating the brain through creativity and imagination might be better to unlock the brain's natural ability to regulate itself. This leads to a broader exploration of how creativity may be one of the brain's best ways to help us thrive. Here to discuss is Professor Angus Fletcher. Professor Fletcher, please introduce yourself and tell us about your work.
My name is Professor Angus Fletcher. I work at Ohio State's Project Narrative, and I am a professor of story science. I am curious about where creativity comes from.
Have you some answers to that question?
What we know about where creativity comes from is that children have a lot of it, and that the more time that children spend in school, the less time the less amount of creativity they seem to have. So we are fairly confident that the answer is something that is natural about the human brain that our society is not doing a great job of cultivating.
So tell me about your work overall at Ohio State University.
The work that I'm doing now started because I was alerted to the fact that there's been a crisis in schools for the past 30 years, which is that schools have been unable to cultivate creativity in students. And creativity is not just the source of art and literature and things like that. Creativity is also the source of innovation and problem solving. It's linked in children to self-efficacy and resilience. And we know that as creativity goes down, anxiety goes up and anger goes up. And we also know that this creativity problem is getting worse because of the use of AI. So I was sort of brought in, even though my primary expertise is not creativity, I was brought in to see if I could provide a new perspective on this problem.
So can you tell me more specifically about what you're doing in your work in narrative theory and creativity, and maybe with project narrative?
A big part of what I do in narrative theory is I study how stories work in the brain. That's what I'm really interested in. And the reason I was brought into this field of creativity studies is for years, going back to a researcher whose name is Anna Kraft, who has since passed away, researchers have noted that creativity in children often takes the form of story. So, for example, children will spend a lot of time role playing. They'll spend a lot of time world building. They'll just spend a lot of time imagining different stories that they're participating in. And this is a function we know that is impossible for computers. Computers cannot think in story for mechanical reasons that I'd be happy to talk about. And because I happen to be an expert in how story works in the brain, I was brought in to see if I could sort of provide some insights. And then primarily what we were interested in doing is figuring out if we could develop exercises in schools that help children access and increase more of their natural creativity.
You had mentioned anxiety and creativity. So is there a connection between mindfulness and creativity?
My research is the opposite of mindfulness, and I'll explain why. So where does anxiety come from? Anxiety and anger, which are these two very common problems that children are experiencing, are part of what is known biologically as your threat response. Your fight or flight response is going active. And so what that's saying to your brain is that I perceive a threat when someone gets anxious or they get angry. The way that schools have historically or recently tried to deal with this is by removing the threat, by creating safe spaces. Mindfulness is basically a version of that. It's a form of dissociative practice where you focus on interrupting the threat response. So you're basically getting your mind to think that the threat isn't there. What we find is that over time, that does not help children, because actually what children want when they experience a threat is a plan to deal with the threat. Your brain evolved, and the reason that your brain goes active in these ways, your brain evolved to come up with threats, and your threat response is telling you, come up with a plan. Figure out a plan to deal with this. And what is another name for a plan? Another name for a plan is a plot. What is another name for a plot? Another name for a plot is a story. And so really what your brain is saying there is come up with a story that we can follow that will fix the situation. And children are naturally good at coming up with stories. And so the fact that they're experiencing so much anger and anxiety in school is really indicative of the fact that schools are somehow interrupting their brain's natural ability to make those stories. And so a big part of what we do is we work with the schools to help reactivate that power in children so they can start to imagine plans and strategies for dealing with what scares them.
If I understand this correctly, you instead of, let's say, a student when they feel anxiety to take breaths and to dissociate, you're recommending that they should think of maybe a way to overcome this through a story, and therefore they need the creativity to be able to do that and to do that effectively. Is that correct?
That's completely correct. So before I started working in schools, I was working with U.S. Army Special Operations. And one of the things that we notice about U.S. Army Special Operators is that they very rarely experience a threat response, even though they're constantly surrounded by threats. So if you walk up to an Army Special Operator and you pull out a hand grenade, they will not have any anxiety or any anger. If you pull the pin on the hand grenade, no anxiety or anger. If you roll the hand grenade towards them, no anxiety or anger. Why is that? Well, because their brain is able to come up with a plan for dealing with that problem. So they were able to plan at the speed of life. And so what we were really interested in studying is how do these operators make these stories, tell themselves these stories, these narratives that they then act to make real so rapidly. And we started to identify some of those mechanisms, and we found that those same mechanisms are active in children, but are being taken away from children in school. And the main reason they're being taken away from children in school is because the number one thing that school teaches you is that there is an answer and the teacher has it. And so when you're in that environment constantly, you're having your own autonomy taken away from you because you're constantly trying to figure out what is it that the teacher wants me to say. And that's debilitating. And that's putting you in a constant state of stress and anxiety where you are out of control of your own narrative. So the first thing that we do when we go into schools is we work with kids and we say to them, what's a concern that you have? What's a problem that you have? Let's work with you on solving that problem. And let's talk with you, if you don't think you can solve that problem, about previous problems you solved in your life. Let's walk you through how you solve those problems. Let's start to figure out your own ability to make plans. And so when we start working with kids on that kind of a practical level, then when things start to stress them out, we say to them, make a plan. They calm down. They say, okay, well, I could try this. I could try this. And, one thing we always say to kids is no plan is ever perfect. So if your plan doesn't work, don't give up. Make another plan.
Can you give me an example of maybe a situation that exists in a college or university setting, like the one that you're in, that maybe is fairly common, and how a student could use the storytelling technique to create a narrative that can help them implement their creativity and resolve their problem?
So the number one problem that every student in college faces is what do they do after college? And they face that problem because they've been told a lie, which is that when they come to college, college will help them figure out the rest of their life. And, college is part of this broken educational system that we're in right now, where the educational system is constantly getting students to study for these tests that have no relationship to the world outside, as opposed to helping them develop their own plans for what they want to do. And so what I do is I sit down with students and I talk them through moments of their life where they felt a sense of success, where they felt a sense of pride that's detached from the valuations they get from their peers and their parents and other outside sources. Because a lot of what students are struggling with is they're struggling with not just how to make myself my best self, but how do I please everyone around me? So we start by getting them clarity on what is your personal goal. And then we start having them practice certain kinds of creative exercises, which I can tell you, where they start imagining plans. I could try this, I could try this, I could try this. And then after we've done that for a little bit, I send them off on an internship or I send them off on some kind of real world experiment. They go off, they try for summer, they come back to the class. I say what worked, what didn't work, and then we try it again. It's a very common sense process. It's not generally what happens in schools nowadays.
And it also kind of flows into that, if you feel stress, take action to overcome it.
Your brain is a muscle. Its job is to move your body. And so your brain likes to act, and it starts to get anxious and stressed out when it's overanalyzing things and it's not able to act. And your brain learns through feedback, through trying things. And that's the difference between a brain and a computer. A computer learns by absorbing huge amounts of data. Your brain gets very overwhelmed with data. And it's much more comfortable trying things and getting feedback. And, we've built these environments that are artificially removed from the world as a way of trying to create calm and serenity, but actually it stresses students out because they're aware that it's an artificial space. And it's actually much more helpful to allow students to go back and forth across the boundary, to say to them, yeah, come back here when you need it, but then as soon as you're calm, go back out again. And practice and discover your strength, discover your resilience. Don't get stressed out about these things. And then when you have a success, take a moment, dwell on it, strengthen those neural pathways.
So, can you tell me some of those exercises that you give students?
So these are all basic theater exercises. These are exercises that have been used for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, but we just don't use them anymore. So I'll give you two simple examples that are effective. The first is to role play somebody else. And the reason this is effective is students are locked today in this idea that there's a right way to do things. And so they think that if they don't have that right way to do it, that there is no way to do it that they can see, and they ask for help or whatever. But instead we say to them, well, imagine somebody else that you know who you think is interesting, who's smart, who's different from you. How do you think they would solve this problem? And we sort of talk them through it from that other perspective that lifts them out of their fight or flight response, that gives them this kind of imaginative sense of possibility, that makes them realize that there's many different ways to solve a problem. Once they can solve a problem like one person, we then work on having them solve that same problem like two people. And we come up with a list of different possible things that they can try. And a big part of this is that we're just emphasizing possibility, things that could work. Another thing we work on a lot with students is what we call plot twists. So a plot twist is a surprise, but in retrospect, it's obvious because it doesn't break the laws of the story. It goes along with them. And so a lot of times we say to students, when was a time in your life when you had an unexpected positive surprise? And talk me through that. And the more they talk through that, the more it develops this natural sense of optimism in them, because they start to realize, good things can happen unexpectedly. And when you start to put together that sense that there are different ways to solve every problem and good things can happen unexpectedly, it just helps the brain start to move forward, because students are just very tentative. They're concerned about getting things wrong. They panic about the idea that somehow, if I take a job, then I'm going to have that job for the rest of my life, all this kind of stuff. And it's like, no, college is supposed to be a space for you to try things in an intentional manner and learn and grow. So a lot of it is just theater exercises. And I haven't said to people, if you don't want to read my research, which is, long and boring and in academic journals, just take an improv class, take a theater class, do some of these things that have been around for a long time, that have developed the brain's ability to be spontaneous and open to its environment.
So, you were talking before about creativity, creating resilience, or maybe you didn't use those words, but in your research, that's what you have said. So, does resilience create creativity?
I mean, there's a kind of virtuous loop there. So first of all, let's start with why creativity produces resilience. Resilience is often understood nowadays as simply being persistence or grit or just trying hard. But actually, a lot of resilience is adaptability.
Mhm.
It's realizing I don't just have to keep trying to go through this same wall. I can go around the wall. And so creativity produces the opportunity for a lot of resilience because it allows you to realize, oh, you know what? I can get up and try differently again. So that's why we see creativity, particularly in young people, really helps build their resilience. Now, the more resilient you are, the more confident you are in your ability to try new things, because you have built in you a sense that if I try something and it fails, I'm not going to break. I'm going to be able to get up again. And so we find the two of them tend to build on each other. So in general, one of the tragedies of modern education is we've stripped so much of theater and literature out of the curriculum. But in general, those are areas where there aren't right answers. There's just opportunities to kind of experiment, to try things, to see what works. If the play doesn't work tonight, I can try it again tomorrow night. Same thing with a poem. I can rewrite it, so on and so forth. And so creativity builds resilience, but also resilience builds creativity in those environments.
Looking at creativity, a lot of people find that they're particularly creative in certain spaces. How does that relate to maybe your work?
One of the things that's sort of strange about the way that academic disciplines work is they always tend towards generalization. And so, one of the sort of examples of generalization is this idea of general intelligence, which is the IQ test, which is wrong. There's no such thing as general intelligence. You can be very, very smart and fail the IQ test. You can do brilliantly on the IQ test and fail all sorts of, intellectual tasks. It's the same thing with creativity. There's no such thing as general creativity. Creativity is an evolved capacity of the human brain to come up with new plans and new actions. That's what we say that it is. And so what that means is that the more familiar you are with a particular domain of life, the more you are able to come up with creative plans and strategies that work. If you happen to be a baker, you're probably pretty good at coming up with creative ways to bake bread. If you're a singer or a dancer, but if you're an engineer, you can come up with creative technologies. If you're a scientist, you can come up with creative theories. If you're a business person, you can be an entrepreneur. So a lot of what creativity is it's tapping into your existing expertise, and then it's allowing you to take that and say, okay, well, what possibilities have not been tried yet? And so it allows you in your particular domain to innovate.
I've read that you've said trying to hire creative people causes problems because the people that leaders identify as creative are almost always people just like themselves. So it promotes conformity instead of originality. So, what is the best way for an organization to increase the creativity in their organization?
What you want to look for is you want to look for people who surprise you, not for people that you think are creative. The reason for this is that when we evaluate creativity, we fall into something that is known as expert bias. And we think that we evaluate things as creative as things that we ourselves would have created. We say, oh, that's very creative because I would have created it. And in reality, it's therefore usually not that creative. But particularly once you start to get into a kind of a group think area, people keep coming up with ideas that blow their minds that are actually very obvious and uninteresting. However, a good indication of something creative is what we call an anomaly or an exception. And an anomaly or an exception will immediately trigger surprise in you, and you won't be able to explain it. You'll say, what is going on? And so, what we often say to organizations is you want to identify things you don't understand and then bring them in. And the more you look at them, and the less you understand about them, the more of a sign that is that that's someone you want inside your organization because they're a real creative.
Can you tell me why you think developing creativity is important for everyone? And also, how does it affect those tedious parts of our lives?
Creativity turns on in the brain when you are bored. We know this because of a kind of a fascinating accidental study that was done over 30 years ago by the scientists who invented sort of the first brain scanners. They invented these brain scanners and they wanted to establish a benchmark of what it looked like when a brain was in the scanner doing nothing. So they put all these people in the brain scanner and they told them, don't think about anything. And the moment they told them that, these areas of the brain just started lighting up. And at first, the scientists were like, these people aren't listening to us. We've got to give them clearer instructions. But the more they stopped the people in the brain scanners from thinking actively, the more this same area lit up. And the scientists named it the default mode network because what they claimed was that this was the network that went active by default when your brain wasn't doing anything. What we know now is that that network powers what's called mind wandering, which is the basis of imagination and these kinds of things. And what's happening there biologically is that our brain discovered that when it wasn't working actively on a problem, it was good to daydream. Because by daydreaming, it was able to come up with new possibilities for its future. It was able to think beyond the immediate pressures of the moment and imagine long-term strategies for the future. That's why many of our best ideas come when we're sort of pottering around, we're gardening, or in the shower, or just going for a walk or something like that. Same thing when you're in traffic. If you are in a place where it's just very routine and you kind of allow your mind to wander a little bit, ideas will start to strike you. So that's why creativity can be productive. It can also be, to your earlier question, a source of life meaning and well-being, because we know that nothing gives the brain more satisfaction than creating something. This is why people get very attached to their own creations. You'll notice this in meetings when people come up with an idea that's theirs. They won't want to let it die, right? Because it's like their child. Sometimes you got to let your ideas die. In fact, a lot of times you got to let your ideas die. But the deeper lesson from that is that creativity is a huge source of purpose and meaning in humans. And the fact that it happens even when you're not working, and in fact, that happens when you're actively not working, should give everyone hope that purpose is waiting for them if they can just get away from the technology, get away from their job for a few minutes, take a walk in nature, and allow this kind of primal imagination to awaken.
Creativity can be when your mind is wandering. So it can take up maybe the same space as maybe worry can take up. So instead of worrying or instead of obsessive kind of compulsive thoughts, do you have ways to guide your brain to kind of to think in a more creative way?
Yeah, so worry and creativity are basically the same thing in the mind. They come from the same roots. But to your point, worry is ultimately painful and not productive. And why is that? It's because we're going back over and over and over again the same things. It's a part of that same kind of, restless imagining of the future. When we're worrying, we're constantly thinking to ourselves, "Oh, this might happen. This might happen. Oh, I have to stop this from happening. I have to stop." Oh, and so our mind is drifting in these ways. So what we always say to people who have high degrees of worry and anxiety is we first of all say that you're a very creative person. You should know that, right? That's a big indicator of creativity. The next thing that we say is that most of the negative things you imagine are going to happen don't happen. We just know this. A tiny, tiny percentage of them happen. So if you're starting to kind of focus or obsess on these negative things, go ahead and write down a plan, write down on a piece of paper what you're going to do when that negative thing happens. You've done your job. Now put that piece of paper away and then liberate yourself to imagine other things could happen. Use that same energy in these other ways. And because really what's happening there is the reason your brain is worrying is it's concerned that somehow you haven't got the plan or taken it seriously. So you can calm your brain down by coming up with a plan, writing it down, and then moving on to other options.
What are things that they could do today? Maybe 3 ways that they could increase their creativity, change their creativity, work with their creativity. What would you recommend?
So first of all, spend some time hanging out with people who are different from you, kids in particular. And as you're doing that, learn to suspend your judgments. What we find with adult brains is that they inhibit a lot of their creativity because the moment they notice something different from themselves, they try and rationalize or judge it. Don't do that. Instead, double down on it. Say, what would happen, right, if we went even more in that direction? If that got even kind of stranger or more unusual? Another basic thing you can do is stop using technology. I know this is something that everybody hears and that nobody does, but computers think associatively. That means that the way that computers create things is random and haphazard. It's just a kind of mishmash of things that they put together. Humans create narratively with a sense of purpose and intention. So the more time we spend using technology, the more disorganized our own creativity becomes, and the less able we are to kind of focus on what is our kind of, unique creativity. The third and final thing I would say is focus on moments in your past when you've done something creative. Reinforce those moments, dwell on them. One of the things we find about very creative people is they spend an enormous amount of time thinking back about their past creations. And what they're doing there is they're both kind of reinforcing those patterns and those behaviors, but they're also developing a sense of optimism. Because optimism is a sense I can create something. And the thing that causes people to shut down creatively is they start to think, oh, I can't do this. Somebody else has an answer. Maybe if I go on the internet, I'll find a way to do this. But if you remind yourself, hey, I created an answer in the past, I can do it again, then the chances are you will.
So I read also that you are talking about this narrative theory in creativity versus kind of divergent thinking, right? And even just today, I was looking up creativity in Google News, and the top story is a New York Times challenge of creativity where they have exercises for people to do in divergent thinking. So it seems like they need to hear about your work and have some more exercises with a narrative theory basis. What would you say about that?
Well, I'd be thrilled if the New York Times wanted to reach out and look at the body of evidence that we've collected that shows that narrative training is more effective than divergent thinking. If you want, I can tell you a little bit of the story about sort of the origins of divergent thinking and why it's so dominant. So basically, in the middle of the 20th century, in the 1940s, the US Army decided that it needed to crack the secret of creativity. And it decided this because at that time, the Army was in charge of the Air Force, and it noticed that certain pilots were more effective than other pilots. And the effective pilots were very creative. They came up with new plans and strategies spontaneously. And they didn't fly like they were programmed. And so they brought in a psychologist. His name was J.P. Guilford. And they said to him, crack the secret of creativity so we can teach all of our pilots to be more creative and we can win this war faster. J.P. Guilford had what was at the time a very unusual theory of the human brain. And his theory was that the human brain was a computer. And he thought this because in 1943, the U.S. Army, again, had just built something called ENIAC, which was the world's first general purpose electronic computer, the same thing that we all use today. And so J.P. Guilford said, I'm going to reduce creativity to computational processes. And by doing so, I'm going to crack the code. He did that in his mind. He reduced creativity to two processes, divergent thinking and convergent thinking. They became the basis of what we now call ideation, which is the basis of design thinking and generative AI. Divergent thinking is what you do when you have a company brainstorm or something like that. Mechanically, what it involves is just randomly associating ideas. In the case of a computer, it's mix and matching from different sets. So this idea has been around now for 80 years as the basis of creativity. And the reason actually that I started working on this problem is because the US Army realized faster than the New York Times that this method does not work, because the US Army was training all of its teams in divergent and convergent thinking, and they were getting less creative. And so I was actually brought in to work with US Army Special Operations to say, what is actually happening with creativity? And that's when we started studying children and realized that humans are not computers. Humans are neurons, and neurons, like children, think in story. And we developed this kind of alternate method, which is based on all these kinds of classic texts, Shakespeare, Maya Angelou, what have you. So that's the kind of the bigger picture there. The fact that it has taken the New York Times a while to get behind this is not surprising, because really it took people 20 or 30 years to get behind the idea of divergent thinking. So my guess is it's going to take people a while to get behind this new idea. But when they do, they'll find they're able to be more creative than AI, and they're able to solve a lot more of the problems that seem overwhelming in their lives right now.
Wonderful. Now that brings me then to the next topic, which is generative AI and creativity, and what you see that will happen. How will we be affected? What are we to do?
I've done a lot of, and I've published a lot of peer-reviewed research on generative AI, and I should start out by saying that I was one of the first people to be brought in from the narrative space to work in natural language processing, which is the basis of these chatbots. And so believe me when I tell you, generative AI is not creative in the way that humans are. It is not going to replace human ingenuity. It is never going to innovate technology. It's never going to do groundbreaking science. It's never going to create new art. And the reason for that is, just as I just discussed, creativity to a computer is randomness plus pattern matching. And it's always some balance between the two of those. So in a computer, if it wants to try and become more creative, it's going to just throw out more haphazard stuff. And if you say, whoa, that's too much, it's going to go back towards what already existed. And what that means is you're always going to get variations on existing stuff. It also means that computers are far better at generating sort of, mild amounts of visual variety or linguistic variety than they are at developing actually new ideas, new plans, new purposes. So the thing about generative AI is, I've been saying for years, it's very overhyped. I think we're reaching peak hype now. I think to the extent that people are scared about it, they don't understand the underlying mechanisms beneath it. If you study how a computer circuit works, you will realize it works very differently from a human neuron. A human neuron is far more mechanically complex, can do far more things. One of those things it can do is think in narrative, which computers cannot do. Those narratives allow you to make original plots and plans, which computers can't do, which is why computers are not going to take over the world, but also why we as humans need to realize that the problems we see in the world are ours to fix. There's not a computer coming to save us from ourselves. And that's why I think it's so important to invest in early education, creativity for children, because ultimately what's going to make the future is kids.
Wow, interesting. And it's so good to hear that. I mean, if we can develop and cultivate and find ways to utilize our creativity, we can have jobs and be relevant and not be taken over by AI systems, because some things probably will be taken over, but at least that portion can be maintained.
Here's the thing about AI. AI is very good at automating existing processes. That's why it exists. And that's what's wonderful about it. It's great for running logistics and library functions and tasks that have already been reduced to a regular set of protocols, because those fields are stable and the data is plentiful. AI cannot and will never be able to deal with edge cases, with volatility, with uncertainty, with anything new. And so what we want to do is we want to focus AI on the tasks that we humans have already figured out the rules to, because it's only good at automating stuff where we've already figured out the rules. It can't just like induct a bunch of data and then figure out the rules for itself. We've tried that with AI. It's a black box mess. But yes, you can have AI regularize certain kinds of tasks and processes, but for anything creative, anything that involves leadership, anything that involves innovation, any of these kinds of things, you're always going to need humans. And also, chatbots are not AI. Chatbots, these LLMs, these are a gimmick, these are a hoax, these are a toy. Now, they're a dangerous and destructive toy. They're plagiarizing a lot of things, they're damaging a lot of people's careers, they're being used to fire a lot of people who should have jobs. So I don't want to minimize the threat, but they are largely gimmicks. And I would just encourage people to put faith in their own biology and realize that LLMs are a fad that is going to pass.
Yes. Is there something I haven't asked you that you would like to respond to?
My main thing is simply that I think we are letting our kids down through a series of well-intentioned schools that are just taking them away from a lot of their natural abilities and are making them lost, confused, anxious, and angry, and are making it hard for them to figure out what to do with themselves when they get outside of school. So if you can just kind of, some of the stuff we said, if you can just kind of put that out there and just, relate to people that this is a problem, but we have an answer to it, and this answer has been tested by these elite military units, yada, 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 then I think hopefully that is the story that I want to, that's really the story that I want to tell to people.
It's not that people necessarily have to take their children out of school and create a whole new way of teaching them or homeschooling them, but they can have other ways to provide their children with additional support for their creativity.
That's right. You do not need to take your kid out of school. There's nothing wrong with school. It's just not providing kids with these creative trainings. So what I would say to people is, first of all, train yourself, get the free field guide, train yourself, then once you start accessing your own creativity, start using that a little bit with your kids. And we work with the American Camp Association. My lab works with the American Camp Association. That's the biggest camp association in America, runs thousands of summer camps. So you can always send your kid to summer camp. And if they go to a good summer camp, they'll go out into nature and they'll have to figure out how to solve problems. Like, how do I light this fire? How do I keep myself from getting wet? How do I get across this river? And just that basic practice of solving those problems that are manageable, that they can solve, but nevertheless give them a sense of achievement in themselves. That's really kind of nurturing all these important healthy abilities that are going to carry them through outside of school into the rest of their lives.
What about sports?
Sports are incredible.
Mhm.
Sports are incredible. I really encourage young people to play sports. I work here with Ohio State Athletics. I work a little bit with the football team, although I cannot take any credit for their success. I work a little bit with the football teams here. And, what I always say is sport is constantly about trying to come up with a plan faster than the other team. That's how you win the game, is you say, okay, I can do this with the ball, or I can do that with the ball, I can do this other thing with the ball. And then if you start thinking as a team, hey, you start to think like the other members of your team, and they're anticipating, hey, the ball's going to go here, the ball's going to go there, or what have you. Developing that kind of ability. In solo sports, if you're playing tennis, it's the same thing. You're trying to figure out, what can I do? How can I set up my opponent? These kinds of things. You're talking with your coach to try to figure it out. These are all ways of figuring out how to develop plans that are being broken actively by your opponent. And so it teaches you to get comfortable with this idea of planning and replanning and replanning and replanning and replanning. And so more than anything else, I don't think it's important that every kid gets a trophy, but I do think it's important that every child gets an opportunity to practice this process of making a new plan and carrying it through to see what happens.
How does curiosity interact with creativity?
Curiosity is the basis of creativity, because curiosity is what cues you into things that surprise you. Those surprises are the anomalies that make you ask, why did that happen? And what else could be possible in the world if that could happen? And that's the basis of where all of our innovations, our original plans, our original everything comes from. So that's why children are creative, because children are curious.
Thank you so much.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.